The day I met Raymond Halstead, he looked at my shoes, not my face, not my hand extended toward him. My shoes, they were clean. Simple. A pair of brown leather Oxfords I'd worn to hundreds of meetings, negotiations, quiet dinners where millions changed hands without a single raised voice. But to Raymond, standing in the foyer of his Scottsdale home with travertine floors and a chandelier that probably cost more than most people's cars, those shoes said everything he needed to know about me. He smiled the way certain men smile, not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of having already formed a conclusion. "So, you're the one keeping my daughter up all night?" he said, gripping my hand once, firmly, then releasing it like he was discarding something. "My name is Daniel Rowe. I was 34 years old that evening. I had $340 million in assets, 2 active acquisitions in progress, and exactly 0 desire to tell Raymond Halstead any of that. I need you to understand something about me before this story makes any sense. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tucson with my mother and my younger brother Marcus. My mother cleaned offices at night and worked a register at a pharmacy during the day. She never complained, not once. She had this way of making Tuesday feel like something worth being grateful for. Leftover soup. A good laugh on the couch, the window cracked just enough to hear the neighborhood wind down. I didn't get into business to prove anything. I got into it because I was 19, curious. And my college roommate needed a co-signer on a food truck loan that I somehow talked myself into believing was a brilliant idea. It wasn't. We lost everything in 8 months. But I learned more in those 8 months than I did in any classroom. The second venture was a logistics software company I built in a spare bedroom with 3 people I trusted completely. We bootstrapped for 2 years. I slept on a pull-out couch for most of them. Then a regional distribution company bought a license. Then another. At 26, I had my first real moment. A wire transfer that still didn't feel real when I stared at it. By 30, I had quietly acquired 4 companies. By 33, I consolidated them under a single holding entity, Meridian Operational Group. We weren't flashy. We didn't have a PR department. We solved real problems in supply chain infrastructure and facilities management for companies that didn't want to read about themselves in Forbes. I never had a reason to advertise myself. It's not humility. It's just how I'm wired. Which is how I ended up dating the daughter of a man who had no idea who I was. Her name was Claire. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Phoenix, one of those long tables where you end up talking to the person directly across from you for 3 hours whether you planned to or not. She was a structural engineer, quiet in that confident way, not the nervous kind. She laughed at the right moments and didn't laugh at the wrong ones. She told me my analogy about load-bearing walls was technically incorrect, but emotionally accurate. I thought about that sentence for 6 days before I texted her. We dated for 10 months before she brought me to meet her family. In those 10 months, she never asked me what I was worth. She knew I owned a company. I told her that in the first week, just the shape of it, nothing granular. She wasn't interested in the numbers. She was interested in whether I'd actually read the novel she'd recommended, and whether I remembered the way she took her coffee, and whether I could sit still on a Sunday without filling the silence with noise. I loved her for all of that. But meeting Raymond was its own kind of silence. The loud kind. The Halstead home was impressive, the way a resume is impressive. You could see the effort behind every choice. Raymond had spent 30 years climbing through corporate ranks before landing as CEO of Veritas Facilities Corp., a mid-sized property management and facilities services company headquartered in Phoenix. It was a solid company, not remarkable. It's the kind that handled large commercial building maintenance contracts, janitorial services, HVAC infrastructure for office parks. Reliable, boring, profitable in the right hands. I knew the company well. I'd acquired it 14 months earlier through a holding intermediary. The board had kept Raymond in place because he had institutional relationships that were worth more than the disruption of replacing him. He was good at the job, knew the vendors, knew the clients. He just didn't know who ultimately sat above the board that had approved his last 3 compensation packages. I had no plan to tell him. That sounds stranger than it is. When you own companies through holding structures, you often don't know the faces of your tenants, and they don't know yours. It's not deception. It's architecture. But sitting across from Raymond at dinner that first night, watching him pour the wine with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed very much in his own gravity, I made a private decision to let things be as they were. "Daniel works in operations," Claire offered when her father asked. Operations. He repeated the word like he was tasting something uncertain. What kind? Infrastructure and logistics consulting mostly, I said. It wasn't a lie. Consulting. Another taste. Good money in that. Enough, I said. He smiled. That smile again. Over the following 8 months, I became a recurring presence in the Halstead family's life. Dinners, a holiday. A weekend in Sedona where Raymond and I were forced into proximity by a shared love of early mornings and the fact that everyone else slept in. Those mornings were genuinely pleasant, in a complicated way. Raymond was smart. I want to be clear about that. He had opinions worth hearing on urban development, on how companies calcified over time, on the particular sadness of watching good people promoted into the wrong roles. It was funny in short bursts. He loved Claire in a real, if clumsy way. But there was always the undertow. Comments about the car I drove, practical, deliberately so. Comments about the kind of man who builds things versus the kind who supports them. Once, when I mentioned I'd just returned from a week in Chicago, he asked if I'd been there for work or just wandering. Claire would catch my eye across the table. She'd press her lips together, that small apologetic signal she had. I'd shrug slightly, which meant, I'm fine, let it go. I was fine, but I noticed everything. The moment things shifted happened on a Thursday evening in March. Claire and I had been discussing moving in together, which meant the topic of a ring was no longer theoretical. I hadn't proposed yet, but I'd already spoken with her mother, Diane, a warm, perceptive woman who I genuinely liked, and she had given me her blessing with a quiet fierceness that felt like being handed something valuable. Raymond didn't know about any of that conversation yet. I arrived at the house that Thursday because Claire had asked me to come for dinner. She was running late from a site visit and said she'd be there by 7. I arrived at 6:30 because I'd misjudged traffic. Ramon answered the door in his work clothes, jacket still on, clearly fresh from the office. He had a glass of scotch. He didn't offer me one immediately, which told me something. We stood in his study, his territory, his bookshelves, his photographs arranged like evidence. He sat down behind his desk without quite meaning to, or maybe meaning to completely. I want to have a conversation with you, he said. All right, I said. Claire's serious about you, more serious than she's been about anyone. He turned the glass slowly. I want to understand what that means for a future, practically speaking. That's a fair thing to want to understand, I said. You're what, mid-30s? You consult? You don't own property? You drive a 4-year-old sedan? He said it without cruelty, just arithmetic. Claire has a career, a good one. I built this family on the idea that the people in it carry their weight. I agree with that principle completely, I said. Not sure you do. He leaned back. I've seen men like you, Daniel, comfortable with enough. That's fine for some people. But my daughter deserves someone who builds, not someone who just. He paused, smiled. Manages the word landed the way he intended it to. I could have said something then. The information was right there, a door I could have simply opened. I didn't. I understand your concern, I said. I'd want the same clarity if I were in your position. He seemed faintly disappointed that I hadn't flinched. I proposed to Claire 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday, in our kitchen, without a plan. I'd had the ring for 3 weeks and kept waiting for the right moment, until I realized I was just nervous, which was new enough to be interesting. She said yes, before I finished the sentence. Raymond shook my hand at the engagement dinner with the same firmness as the first time, not quite warm, not dismissive. Somewhere in the narrow corridor between those two things, Diane hugged me for a long time and whispered, "Take care of each other." I told her I intended to. The twist, when it came, arrived in the most ordinary possible way. It was a Saturday, 4 months before the wedding. Raymond had been having a difficult quarter at work. I knew this not because he'd told me, but because I received operational summaries from Veritas's board liaison as a matter of course. Client attrition in 2 regions. A contract renewal that hadn't landed the way Raymond had projected. The board was patient, but patience had a shape, and that shape was getting narrower. He was at our apartment for the first time. Claire had invited her parents for Sunday brunch. Diane was in the kitchen with Claire. Her man was in the living room. And I watched him without meaning to, watched him clock the space, the bookshelves, the art we'd chosen together, the absence of things that would signal a certain kind of wealth. He picked up a framed photo on the shelf. A picture from a company retreat 3 years ago, me and the 4 founding members of Meridian at a rooftop dinner in Denver. It was casual, laughing, not the kind of photo that announced anything. "This your company?" he asked. "One of them," I said. He set it down. "One of them." He said it the way you'd say sure it is. Then his phone rang. I watched his face change as he answered it. The color shifted somewhere between his eyes and his jaw. His voice went careful in the way voices go when control is being actively maintained. "I'll call you back," he said. He hung up. He sat down. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Board meeting Monday," he said. "Apparently there's a strategic review." He exhaled. "New ownership has been quiet for over a year. I think they're finally making moves." I said nothing. "I've run that company well," he said, and for the first time. The confidence in his voice had a hairline crack running through it. "Margins are solid. The client base is loyal. If they bring in someone new, they'll lose." He stopped. Looked at me with something I hadn't seen from him before. Vulnerability. "You understand this world? What does a strategic review usually mean?" I sat across from him. Here it was. The moment I hadn't designed but had somehow arrived at anyway. "It depends on what the ownership is looking for," I said carefully. "Sometimes it means restructuring. Sometimes it means they're happy with leadership and want to formalize that." "I can't read these people," he said. "The board is professional, but opaque. The holding company, Meridian something, Meridian Operational Group," I said quietly. He looked at me. I held his gaze. The silence lasted for seconds, maybe 5. I watched it happen, the arithmetic, the sequence of recognition, the pieces assembling themselves without my help. "No," he said. "It's not an argument. More like a word you say when you're buying time. Raymond, He stopped. "You own Meridian." I founded it, yes. Veritas was an acquisition 14 months ago. He didn't move for a long moment. "You've known," he said, "this whole time?" "Yes, and you didn't." He pressed his hand flat against his thigh. "Why didn't you say anything?" I thought about this carefully before answering, because it wasn't relevant to anything that mattered between us. And because I wanted you to know me before you knew that. He looked toward the kitchen. Claire's laughter drifted out. She was telling her mother some story, animated, happy. The sound of it settled over both of us. "The review," he said. "Quieter now. Is that about me?" "No," I said honestly. "It's about 2 underperforming regional contracts. You're not the variable they're looking at." He absorbed this. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out stiff, like they'd been stored somewhere uncomfortable. "The things I've implied. The way I've—" He stopped again. "I had you figured for someone who hadn't built anything?" "I know," I said. "That was arrogant of me." "It was," I agreed. "But I also understand it. You were protecting Claire." The instinct was right, even if the read was wrong. He was quiet for a while. Outside, a car passed. Inside, the sounds of the kitchen continued, warm, oblivious, separate from this room. "My father told me once that the loudest men in a room are usually protecting something," Raymond said finally. "I've spent a lot of my life being loud. I didn't offer him absolution. That wasn't mine to give. But I nodded, because it was true, and he knew it, and sometimes that's enough of a beginning." We got married in October. Raymond gave a toast that surprised everyone at the table, including Claire. He talked about what it meant to misjudge a person and what it costs you, not in dramatic terms, but in the quiet way of someone who'd spent some months sitting with a truth they hadn't asked for. He said Daniel had been patient with him in ways he hadn't earned. He said he hoped to deserve it going forward. Claire squeezed my hand under the table so hard, I felt it in my shoulder. Afterward, by the bar, Raymond and I stood side by side, looking out at the dance floor where Marcus was already embarrassing himself to everyone's delight. "That brother of yours," Raymond said. "I know," I said. "You two are close." "He's the reason I work hard," I said. He looked at me sideways, not sizing me up this time. Something else, closer to curiosity. The real kind, the kind that's earned. "Tell me about how you built it," he said. "From the beginning." So I did. And somewhere around midnight, Raymond Halstead, a proud man, a complicated man, a man who had spent decades measuring the world by its visible surfaces, leaned against the bar and listened. Actually listened. The way you only listen when you've accepted that you were wrong, and the wrongness has humbled you into genuine openness. We stood there for almost 2 hours. It was the best conversation we'd ever had. I think about my mother sometimes when these moments come, the trajectory of things. The distance between that two-bedroom apartment and where I stand now, I don't think she'd be surprised. Exactly. She always acted like Tuesday was enough. But she also always acted like I was capable of more than I knew. I was right about both things. I never needed Raymond to be impressed by me. That's the part that matters. The money, the companies, the structure of it all, none of that would have meant anything if I hadn't learned first. In a spare bedroom with a pull-out couch and 3 people I trusted, that the work was its own reward. But I'll admit something, quietly, just between us. When he finally asked me to tell him the story, I was glad I'd waited.